Hello everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw this dog nose. So this was a pet portrait that I did a few months ago, and this was one that I wanted to make sure I got uploaded as a real-time tutorial on Patreon. So at times you're going to see my hand maybe moving where I'm explaining what I'm doing, the colours that I'm selecting. Here I'm just explaining your perspective and how it's really important to make sure that you've got the shape and the position of the nostrils in the right place. This is the main thing that I want to focus on regardless of the nose that I am drawing in a pet portrait of any size. I do want to make sure that I've got the nostrils, the midline in the centre of the nose in the right place, and also that it stops at the right height. We don't want to be making that line in the middle of the nose too long, and you'll see that when I get to that part of the tutorial. So I do make sure that I spend a lot of time getting the size of the nostrils and the shape of the nostrils and the position and placement as accurate as I can to that reference photo. And I follow the same process. So I then map in this midline as I've said, and then I can really make sure that I have got the basic shape in place, just like what I'm working on here on the bottom edge. And then all I then need to start worrying about is the layering process and getting that colour of the dog nose correct. Now, most of the time you might have more of the black nose on the reference photo with the pet portrait that you're working on, but some dogs like the chocolate labs or the yellow labradors like Dexter here do have this browner, more purpley coloured nose. So for this I do have a specific set of pencils that I get out in front of me to start with, and then if I need to I can add additional colours. Now the real time, it's almost a 1 hour tutorial available on Patreon. I really am explaining why I'm selecting those colours and why I'm layering them in that specific order. Now, just like with working with acrylics or oils, how much pigment you put on the paper when you're working with pastels, you will get a slightly different colour. Now, I think that's a huge advantage to using pastels, unlike colour pencils. You can use them like paints by mixing your various layers together if there's one specific colour that you might not have in your set. And this is something that I had to do with this dog nose here. There wasn't one specific colour, and there very rarely is. Sometimes we sit and think, I really wish I knew the exact colour, that one pencil that I'm missing, but quite often it's never the case. It is very much a layering process and pairing various layers together in order to get that one colour that you're after. And that's also something I spoke about in the tutorial where I showed you how to draw this type of fur colouring. That is also available on YouTube, and again the real-time tutorial is also available on Patreon for that as well. But for the front surface of the nose, like what I'm working on here, I'm going to be working from dark to light. Most of the time with something like this, that is typically how I like to work in order to build up as much depth as I can. I've made sure that I'm going in with some of the nice Pitt colours, some of those browner colours to start with, and then I can start adding my more muted colours on top. Now the reason for that, and it isn't just with noses of this colour, it might be anything where you want to try and keep that colour saturation vibrant. You want to be trying to put those colours down first in most cases to make sure that you do have that vibrancy in place from the start. What can happen if you were to start off with a dark brown base layer here and then try and add your browns or your Pitt colours on top, you do run the risk of muddying up those layers, and then it's a lot more of a difficult sort of place to then be to try and get that vibrancy back in place. So the one thing that I like to do, as I say, is I put those brighter colours down first. I can then start adding in my darker details, start to breaking up the larger section of the front surface of the nose. Now also something you'll see from many of the tutorials here that I've got on YouTube, I like to work in small areas. I do find that it breaks down that one element, like this nose here. I'm not working on the whole base layer of the entire nose, then the second layer, and then adding my details. I'm just working on the front surface of the nose. I can then start working on the top surface and then the edge of the nostrils and so on. The reason why I like doing that is I find, as I say, it breaks down that one element that's quite tricky. There's quite a lot of subtle detail and lighting that I want to get in this nose here. As you can see from the size of my hand, it was quite a nice size portrait to work on, so I had that little bit of extra room to add more detail. I therefore wanted to make sure that I didn't rush any part of this, and as I say, I really did study that reference photo to put in these subtle details, the highlights and the shadows. Often you hear me speak about in my tutorials where I don't worry about the exact colour. For me, I focus a lot more on the contrasts, your lights and your darks. However, for a nose like this, I do make sure as best as I can, as always with anything that I'm working on, I try and go as close as I can to the reference photo. But for something like this, I want to try and add in areas where I see more purple, where I see more of a pinker highlight. I do want to try and make sure that I get that variation on a nose like this. That's going to help to make this nose that much more realistic. Now, something that you'll see here, although I'm using light pinks, they're not overly bright, and that's because I'm not putting too much pressure on that pencil. It's really important to make sure that you don't apply too much pressure because you don't want to end up with too harsher details. And with pastel pencils, the more pressure you put on that pencil, the more pigment you're going to force out of that lead. You're going to start to create some thicker lines as well, which might not be the kind of detail that you're going for. So most of the time, I really do ease off on that pressure, especially when I'm working on these subtle details. And here I'm just explaining really the 3D effect of the nose that I want to try and make sure I've got that where the nostrils are curving over onto the front surface of the nose. It's really important, and as I've said at the beginning of the video, it's something that I pay attention to regardless of the size of the portrait that I'm working on. So if I've got an 8x10 portrait and that nose might only be the size of my fingernail, I still want to make sure that if I can indicate it that 3D rolled over effect of the nose. That's what's going to make it more realistic rather than worrying about the exact colour. As long as you've got your highlights and your shadows in the right place and the light source is captured, that nose will look realistic regardless of the size. It's just obviously that much nicer when you are working on a larger scale like what I am here, that you have that extra room to add those finer details. Now, something else you'll notice as well, that for the top surface of the nose here, I haven't gone down with the same colour base layer. And I think this is something that can be sort of quite easy to do. When you look at something like this, it's quite tempting to put the same colour all over for the base layer. Now for me, I pay a lot of attention to my base layers. I think they're really important. And if you've seen many of my other tutorials here on YouTube, you'll know that I do put a lot of emphasis on this process. It's our foundation for our detailed layers, so I do like taking that time to make sure that I've got this initial layer fairly close to that reference photo. Now, of course, we can tweak that base layer. It's very forgiving when we're working with pastels, especially when we're working on Pastelmat. But I do still want to make sure that I'm mapping in approximately the right colour, but also more importantly where my lights and my darks are. Once I've got that base layer in place there, I'm now starting to really work on the shape of the nostrils and how those shadows curve over. I want to make sure that I've sort of made this look three-dimensional. I do not want this nose to look flat. When we are working on dog noses, it's going to vary considerably depending on that light source. Because the dog nose, it does have that wetter look, it's going to be very reflective and it is going to represent that light source quite strongly. So we want to make sure that we have got those highlights in the right place. That's therefore going to cast shadows on certain areas. Some of the details are going to potentially be more brighter on the left or the right hand side. So you do want to make sure you zoom into that reference photo and put in where those highlights and the shadows are. When we're working on the nose, we want to make sure that we are putting those in the right place because it is going to completely change the shape of that nose. If, for instance, the highlight on the top edge that you'll see me get to shortly, if I was to put that too lower down, I'm going to completely change the shape of the nose. So I do want to make sure that I've got these highlights and my shadows correct right from the very beginning if I can. It will help to make sure that I'm following that perspective of the reference photo right from the start. If, however, you do notice that you've put your nostrils in a slightly different position, maybe you've made them too far apart, you've got one higher than the other, you can very easily change it. You can layer more of those lighter colours over the top to fix that placement, and it is a lot easier if you find that you've made the nostrils too small. You can just take your black pastel pencil and obviously then make those nostrils larger. So because as long as you haven't filled the tooth of the paper, you can make these changes when working with pastels. So this part of the process is my favourite part. So this is where I start to add some more of the dimension to it by adding more of my mid-tone highlights. I can then gradually start adding some very subtle, lighter details, adding more depth with each layer and each pencil stroke that I add. Another thing that can vary quite a lot with dog noses is the texture. Some noses have more of a smoother appearance while others look more bumpy and more textured. So you want to make sure that you have captured that in your artwork depending on what that reference photo is showing you. For Dexter here, this nose was very smooth. It didn't have many of that bumpier texture that you can sometimes see. So I wanted to make sure that I used more smoother techniques to make sure that I wasn't adding too much texture with my pastel pencils. One of the things that I also find when working on noses like this is they don't look fairly realistic until you start adding these details like what I'm working on now. So my biggest tip, and I speak about it a lot in my Patreon tutorials, is just trust the process. If you know that your proportions and your perspective is correct, but you think that there's something that's just throwing you off ever so slightly, it's probably because you don't yet have those final highlights on the top of the nose. Make sure that you do add those in, but add them in gradually. You'll see here that I have not added that highlight right from the very beginning with a white pencil. I've built up those details. Now again, depending on that light source, you might have a very bright highlight somewhere on the nose. So in that case, I might want to map in that first with one of my white pencils, just to make sure that I've kept that as bright as it needs to be. But most of the time, I will have some colour underneath for my base layers, just like the process that you've seen here. And what I'll do is, once I've refined some of the colour, just like what I'm working on here, I will then darken up the nostrils and the line on the middle of the nose if I need to. Something that can happen is it sometimes looks like the blacks have faded, and that isn't what's happening, but what can happen is a very, very fine layer of the pastel pigment can settle over the top of your darker areas. It just then makes the darks look a little bit muted. So what I do, and I do this also with the outline of the eyes, I will go over the top with my black pencil just to make sure that I've got my contrast as sharp as it needs to be. So here you can see, so I'm just adding now some very final details, switching between some light purples and my white, just to make sure that I've got as much depth as I possibly can here. And I get it about 80% complete. I can then start working on the area around the muzzle and then add, if I need to, some very final details to the nose. Because quite often an area that you think is finished isn't quite finished until you've got the area around it complete, and then that's when you might notice that you need to tweak a couple of things. It's always a good idea to take a step back and really look at that artwork with fresh eyes, leave it a day or two and go back to it, and then sometimes you will notice other areas that you do need to adjust. It might just be a very slight change in colour in one area, or adding a little bit more bright to your highlights and so on, but it can make a difference to just look at that artwork with fresh eyes. Because we spend so long sat at that easel, it can be very easy to get a little bit blinded by the details that can take that artwork to the next level. And here is a photo of the finished portrait of Dexter. Now, I personally find this one of the most challenging fur colours to get right. I want to make sure that I don't get any muddy layers. I want to make sure that I've got that really nice light golden colour. So I do have a real-time tutorial available on Patreon showing you the exact colours that I used and the layering process to get that colour. Because something that I found with this is, depending on how you layer and the order of colours that you use, you can get a slightly different colour. That's not a bad thing, but it is something that I wanted my Patreon members, because again, this was one where they said that they'd like to see an in-depth tutorial for this. I wanted to make sure that I covered that. So if that is of interest, I'll link that in the description below. And of course, the almost 1 hour tutorial of this dog nose is also available over there now. So I'll link all of that in the description. If you've got any questions, feel free to comment below or message me on any of the social medias. And I might upload another video next week. Obviously it's being Christmas. If I don't, I hope you all have a lovely Christmas, and I'll be uploading again in the new year.